This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review. And my last 3 videos were of documentaries on serial killers, which I will continue to do. I did have some that just came in, and there's more that I can find. But now I'm going to go back to films based on serial killers because I did the documentaries because I was waiting for these to come in. But my last video was John Borowski's documentary on Carl Panzram, so I figured that this will be the first of this new batch of films that came in. And this is actually a theatrical film. You don't get a whole lot of serial killer theatrical films. They're usually direct-to-video or streaming or TV movies. But this came out in 1995, and I had actually never heard of this film until I first made my list of real-life serial killer films to check out. But at first, I was wondering if the casting would work, because I really like the actor that plays Panzram in this. But I started thinking, like, would that work? Does he really look like him, or can he act like him? But then after seeing some pictures after our first few scenes, this is actually a really good performance by him, and that's James Woods. And it's the 1995 film Killer, A Journal of Murder. And yeah, this is just a cheap-ass, bare-bones DVD. Which, it's loosely based on the book by the same name by Thomas E. Gaddis and James O. Long, which, to the best of my understanding, is the fullest version we have of Panzram's autobiography that he wrote while he was in jail in D.C. at the behest of guard Henry Lesser. It was produced by Tim Metcalf, who also wrote the screenplay. He found the book somewhere, in like a flea market or an old bookstore, really liked the story, and he spent years actually trying to get the film made. So he wrote the screenplay, and it's actually produced by Oliver Stone, which I did not know. I actually wondered what it would have been like had Stone directed it. And yeah, the film is dedicated to Sam Peckinpah, who directed The Wild Bunch, because Metcalf was a huge fan of The Wild Bunch. But it stars James Woods as Carl Panzram, Robert Sean Leonard as Henry Lesser, and then we have appearances by Cara Buono, Ellen Green, Robert John Burke, Steve Forrest. And people that I recognized, we have Jeffrey DeMunn, who the same year would play Andre Chikatilo in Citizen X, great movie. He plays Lesser's father in like one scene. We got Richard Reel as Warden Quincy, which Woods and Reel would be in Scorsese's Casino the same year. And yes, just small trivia, James Woods' mother plays a bartender in an uncredited scene. So, before I get too far, just know this is not a film based on sort of the life of Carl Panzram. This is not like a life biopic. Even though it's based on the book that's essentially his autobiography, it's more of one of those serial killer films that, actually I would almost hesitate to call it a serial killer film, because it just barely touches the fact that he is a serial killer. We get 2 kills on screen. He does confess to the 21 that he confessed to after he was arrested in D.C., but this is one of those films where it more so takes place during a certain window of time or a certain event, and it's more so built around the friendship between Panzram and Lesser from 1928 up until his execution in 1930. Though it does briefly go over his life, it shows Lesser sort of reading over the autobiography, and then through voiceover and flashback, we kind of get key moments of Panzram's life. But it's really like a 10-15 minute sequence, if that. The movie itself really takes place during his when he first gets arrested in DC 1928, leading up to his execution. And even then, I thought this was a good movie. Is it very accurate? No, not it. It's not the least accurate one I've seen. It does mix a lot of events. For example, it takes place at the Fort Leavenworth prison, which is where Pangeram was executed. But he met Lesser at D.C. before he got tried and sentenced to Fort Leavenworth. So they kind of mix a lot of things, but it does have some smaller details that, cause it says it's loosely based on the book, but it's pretty close to Pangeram's life. So I'm not quite sure where the loosely part comes in about the book. I do not own the book. It is one that I would really like to pick up. I also don't have John Borowski's books. I believe he also wrote a book. He usually does write a book that goes with his films. So I don't have any books on Pangeram specifically. But, as always, he'll pop up in any comprehensive encyclopedia, which, he's in ones like this, and this one just came in, he is in this one, and this big beast that just came in, Visual History. He's in bigger books like that. As far as documentaries, I don't think he's in this one, but I do believe he's in this one, which is almost the same thing. I do believe he's in that. But you can find episodes of, like, Most Evil or Born to Kill, because he is a pretty notorious killer, especially from the turn of the century, like 20s, 30s era. He was executed in 1930. But yeah, the whole film is basically built around the friendship of Pangeram and Lesser. And it's kind of built on that sentiment that Lesser is known for, which is because it hints towards other parts in Pangeram's life that's kind of similar, about how he's this guy that's just been beaten, tortured, abused, raped his whole life, in and out of prisons. All the prisons are very brutal. Therefore, every time he gets out, he just wants revenge on the world. But when someone's actually nice to him and treats him like a human, he does all right. Like it shows the one warden, Spud Murphy, in Oregon. It shows that he was a guy that trusted Pangeram. He gave him some freedom and was nice to him and started to show some improvement. One thing it doesn't do, which was smart, it doesn't humanize Pangeram. It doesn't humanize him. It doesn't sympathize with him. It sympathizes with him to a certain extent. Like, okay, we get that this guy's been abused and brutalized his entire life, but that's pretty much the extent of it. Really, the heart of the film lies with Lesser. And I do commend the film for not getting really schmaltzy, like, because this came out the year after Shawshank Redemption, and I'm glad it didn't really go that route with making these two guys super, like, sort of like the friendship version of soulmate, like best friends, in like a very heartfelt, almost sugar-coaty way. It doesn't go that route. I thought it was going to. That would have been a real Hollywood treatment if it did, but it didn't do that, so I'm glad it didn't do that. But it does show Pangeram as just this ruthless, violent, mean, hateful, spiteful, vengeful human being who is just out to get the world, and then at the end just wants to die. Tired of life, tired of the world, and wants to get out of it. And Woods does do a good job. I mean, does he look like Pangeram? Not always. It might depend on what he's wearing or how he has his hair. But this is one of the better Woods performances, I think. I mean, there are times where, yeah, sort of the fast-talking sarcasm of James Woods comes out. But there are scenes, where he kind of turns into a beast and he turns into Pangeram. And he is convincing. So I would say this is a very good performance. Upon reading, I did see that John Malkovich was originally approached along with a few other actors, but I know Malkovich was one of them. And I wonder what Malkovich could have done. I'm a big fan of his, and I do think he could have pulled off Carl Panzram. But Woods did do a good job. Uh, I really did like Robert Sean Leonard as Lesser. You really buy the sympathy, the heart, the sincerity of that character, and it does do a good job at showing just the inhumanity of prisons at that time. It doesn't dwell on it, but like the first half, you do see Panzram getting the shit beat out of him quite a bit. It does have some cool stylistic choices as well. Like when Lesser is reading the autobiography after Panzram gave it to him, and we're seeing it with Wood's voiceover, and it's done in black and white. When it gets to the segment in Oregon, when Warden Spud Murphy gives him freedom to go outside, go do what he wants, as long as he returns by dinner, and like when that door opens, it's kind of like a Wizard of Oz moment. Like it turns to color, as if to say that's the first bit of humanity he's ever felt. So I really like stylistic choices like that. It is shot very well. It also has music by Graham Revel, he's actually done the score for quite a bit of films that I like. But yeah, I can see people maybe not liking this because it's not a biopic. You're not really seeing the extent of how brutal he was as a killer. I mean, he confessed to killing 21 people, and not just people, but like boys and men. And on top of all the robberies, arsons, and everything he's committed, he bragged about committing over 1,000 acts of sodomy on boys. It doesn't go into really how maybe depraved of a brutal person that he was, but it does do a good job at just showing the hate that's in this guy, how there's constant burning hate at the world. And when it's given that segment of like the black and white flashback of his life, it does do a decent job at painting that picture. I would say you almost need a whole film to do that. Uh, Panzram went through so much in his life and did so much in his life up until 1928, the first 37 years of his life, that you would almost need a full movie to really paint that picture. But what it does give us, it does do a good job of. And yeah, all the performances are good. Now, as far as the accuracy, yeah, they do mix stuff. They put Lesser in Fort Leavenworth. They move everything to Fort Leavenworth. They kind of change his trial around a little bit. But there are a lot of lines that are taken directly from Panzram's writing and books. Oddly enough, not the most famous ones. Like the hurry up you Hoosier bastards. When he's up on the gallows, that line was changed a little bit. He never tells Lesser, "You're the one man I don't wish to kill." But there are a lot of quotes that I do remember being lifted directly from his writing. So it's a solid film, even if you take Panzram out of it. The quality, it's still a decent film. It is a good story. This guy who's just hell-bent on revenge at the world, in a world where, might is right. You just fight violence with violence. Brutal punishment is necessary, and that's why he's that way. But then you have a sympathetic guard come in and befriend the guy because he doesn't have any. And it kind of starts to bring out a little bit of humanity in him, but it kind of has that tone or that feeling of too little, too late. And, it's shot beautifully. All the performances are really good. I might say this is my favorite James Woods performance. Either that or Once Upon a Time in America. would be my favorite James Woods. But Robert Shaw Leonard, really good job as Lesser. All the supporting casts, like Richard Reel as the Warden, it actually did a better job at the history of Panzram, like when we're getting the voiceover flashbacks. But and for a killer where there's not a whole lot known about him, I mean, even in books like this, the the portions of Panzram are actually really short because there's not a whole lot of documentation about him. He did spend a lot of time abroad, and a lot of what he's known for could never really be corroborated. It's all hearsay, kind of like Henry Lee Lucas, but maybe not to that extent. So there's not a whole lot known about him factually. So so they did do a good job of sort of the highlights during the flashback sequence. And I would say this is the most interesting portion of Panzram's life, and I thought they told it well. So, not much to say about it other than that, but I did end up having to take quite a bit of notes because this was a movie that did have a lot happening in it. So, can definitely recommend it. Certainly as a movie, it is a good movie. Um, just know that no, it's not Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. It's not, the Netflix Dahmer series. We get one brutal kill, which is when he kills the one guard in the prison laundry who keeps screwing with him, which was factual. He beats him to death with an iron bar. We do see that, and it's done in a pretty brutal way. We see Panzram get the shit beat out of him quite a bit. But other than that, no, it's not a graphic serial killer movie. So just know that going into it, because I know a lot of people will just dismiss a movie like that because it doesn't show anything. But it's still a good film. So with that, yeah, other than that, I can definitely recommend it. So I guess we'll get into the short summary and then the film itself. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film is based on. So Carl Panzram is another early American serial killer who confessed to killing 21 men and boys between 1920 and 1928, with 5 of them actually being confirmed. Panzram is one of the most savage, hateful, and proudly mean-spirited killers in history, gleefully bragging about his hatred of the human race and committing a number of arsons, robberies, and claiming to have sodomized 1,000 boys, and serving in at least 100 jails and prisons throughout his life. Starting at age 12, he started to commit crimes and began his life in and out of correctional facilities, where he was beaten, sodomized, tortured, either as punishment or even without cause. After numerous escapes and aliases in his wide range of crimes, including murder, he was finally apprehended in 1928 in D.C. for stealing a radio and jewelry, where he confessed to all his murders, and then was sent to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas and was finally executed by hanging in 1930, the state's first since 1870. Panzram left many writings, all detailing his hatred for mankind, his revenge on the world, and how to treat and teach a child differently, or will end up with another Carl Panzram. While in D.C., he wrote an autobiography, which Panzram's only friend, a guard named Henry Lesser, attempted to publish for over 40 years, and was finally published in 1970. Other than that, all we have are some collections of his writings. So that was the best I could do for Panzram because it's very murky, a lot of the stuff about him, and actually a lot of sources are very contradictory, but I did the best I could. So the film opens up seemingly like we're talking to an elderly Henry Lesser, is sitting in the position, camera angle of, say, an interview, saying how, he just got a job as a prison guard, and then he met a really good friend. He met the kind of person no one else should meet. He met Carl Panzram. And so then we flash back to Panzram being arrested for burglary, which is true. It was his last arrest as a free man in 1928. Now, sources differ. Like, he was arrested in D.C. Some places will say the burglary took place in D.C. Other places say it took place in Baltimore, that he was sent to D.C. Or the crime took place in D.C. But some sources will say he was arrested in either D.C. or Baltimore because there was a murder in Baltimore just prior to that. So that's what I mean. Sources vary on some things. But either way, he was either in or sent back to D.C., and then that was the prison he was serving in when he met Henry Lesser. But the film says Fort Leavenworth Prison, 1929. So it's just not really consolidating, but it's placing the whole story in Fort Leavenworth, which, he served so many months in D.C., and that's where he met Henry Lesser. But the film shows Lesser, the whole relationship happening in Fort Leavenworth. Which he actually arrived there February 1st of 29. Lesser is shown to be Jewish, which is true. His father was a Jewish immigrant. And it shows him to be married with a son. I don't know if he was married he married his wife Esther in 1935, or met and married her in 35, and then a son followed. I don't think he was married prior to that, so he wasn't married at the time that this happened. Shows Lesser as a brand new guard, even getting a tour of the prison. He did start earlier that year, like he was hired in March of 28, and Pandram came in, I think, in August, late August, early September of 28. So he had already worked there for some time. His prison number is 31614, which is true to his Leavenworth number, but because I think Lesser is reading something or from Pandram, but yeah, it says 31614. That's his Leavenworth number. In D.C., which is when he knew Lesser, his number would have been 33379. It shows Pandram working in the prison laundry and being harassed by a guard. That was something that happened in Leavenworth, and that is true. The foreman, either of all jobs or at least laundry, was a guy named Robert Warnke, and it even shows Pandram telling him to stop writing him, giving him warnings, which he didn't do often, and that he's brutalized by guards, which he is a number of times. It shows a prison trustee, the guy with the card that gives people their mail or whatever, which I think that guy is played by one of the rednecks that's in a lot of Rob Zombie movies, including Devil's Rejects and Halloween. He gives Pandram a $1 bill, saying that is from Lesser, which Lesser did give Pandram a $1 bill, but he gave it to him himself. And I think it was after he was brutalized by guards. So then Lesser enters Pandram's cell for a mandatory search, but he sets his thing down, turns his back, and Pandram tells him, "You're a brave man. Don't ever do that again. Don't ever turn your back on me." That was something that he said to Lesser. But I don't know if it was that exchange or one later on, like right before he was hanged, where he says, "You're the only man I don't want to kill." That line he doesn't say. Pandram states he wants to write his story and asks Lesser if he can supply him with paper and pencils, but Lesser tells him it'd be against the rules. In real life, Lesser spent a couple weeks trying to get Pandram to write his story. He kept, saying he didn't want to, and then Lesser was the one that provided him with the paper and pencils, which the movie shows him giving him a full notebook and then him writing it seemingly in one sitting. It was a 20,000 word book or confession. When in reality, Lesser would give him like a handful of papers at a time, and then he'd smuggle them back out. So it actually took a lengthy period to write the whole thing. But he gives him the whole notebook, then Lester starts to read it, and then that's when we get like the black and white flashback to his life, which he says he was born June 28th, 1891 in Minnesota on a farm. True. With 6 siblings. True. Drunkard by 9, thief by 10, and sent to Red Wing Training Facility. True. I believe he was sent there when he was 12. When he got out, he hopped on a train. He wanted to go be a cowboy and was raped on the train. I think it shows 2 guys doing it, where he was raped by 4 on a train in real life. Mentions that he committed a series of petty crimes that went into the army, and then straight to the army stockade, which is true. He was 16 when he went in the army. He lasted a month. Then he was put in the army jail. Which actually, it didn't show how he joined the military. He was drunk one night, and someone asked his age, and he lied. And then he was told about the military and joined. Showed that he played nice and acted like he loved Jesus, so he got out early. Until he got out in 1911, which I believe he got out in 1910, actually. And then committed more crime, and says he met every kind of crook there was. I mean, those are all the people he was around. Then he made it to Oregon, in Oregon State Penitentiary. True. Doesn't mention it, but he was under the name Jefferson Baldwin in 1915. This is when you get the picture of him with the 7390 prison number. Mentions how every prison he was in had some kind of torture. It shows him in like a bathtub hooked up to like car batteries, which is true. That was a form of torture in one or several of them. He saw another inmate kill a warden in Oregon, which is true. The warden's name was Harry Minto, who was a brutal warden. But then the new warden said his name was Charles Casey. His real name was Charles Murphy. They nicknamed him Spud because the worst punishment you get is peeling potatoes, as mentioned in the film. Shows him with number 7390 in Oregon, which was his number, and that Spud lets him out for a day if he promises to come back, and he does. Which is true. Spud thought, if you treated men right, they would act right. So he would let him go outside, no guards, no chains, as long as he came back by dinner. Panzram did. He was allowed to do a bit more. He's allowed to go to the next town to visit the library, where he befriends a librarian and then rapes her. I don't think that happened, but this leads to the end of that warden's reform program, or at least for Panzram. How that ended in real life was he went to the town, got drunk, lost time, wasn't back by the time he was supposed to be, so he ran away. He was gone for like 2 weeks, and then he was found, brought back, beaten, and he didn't have any more privileges after that. Shows his first kill after an escape, which is true. 1920 was his first murder. It shows him stabbing a man in an alley, which I always read that it was with a gun on his yacht that he bought with the money from stealing jewelry and bonds from former President Taft. But again, even then, different sources will say that he either slit sailors' throats or shot them while on his boat, because he started sailing the world at that point. But it mentions that he robbed $40,000 in jewelry and Liberty bonds and a pistol from former President Taft. True. And the reason why he was so happy to do that was because he served in Fort Leavenworth when he was younger, and Taft was the one that okayed the sentence. Shows his attempted escape from Dannemora prison in New York, which I believe was the last one he was in before his arrest at the beginning of the film. Jumping out of a window and falling over 30 feet, breaking both his ankles, a leg, fracturing his spine and getting a rupture, probably to his spleen. He did break his ankles, legs, badly hurt his spine, and ruptured something, probably his spleen, in real life. But it wasn't from falling out of a window. It was from a makeshift ladder that he made trying to scale the walls of the prison. It buckled and fell under his weight, and he fell about 30 feet. But it mentions that he got no attention. He was left for 14 months, without his bones being set or fixed, which is true. But what it doesn't mention is that after 14 months, he went in for an operation to fix his rupture, and when he woke up, he had it fixed, but he was also a testicle short. So the film doesn't mention that. It says he's 39 and has killed 21 men and boys and broke every law known to man. Very similar to things that he would say, and glad to do it. I don't feel bad for, I don't feel a damn bit bad for any of it. But at this time, he probably would have been 37, at the time of writing for Lesser. It portrays Pantram's telling of killing 21 people as a confession in the book, sort of in private, when he was first arrested in D.C., he just openly told the guards or arresting officers that he's killed people. Which some sources say, yeah, I've killed 21 people. Some sources say, I've killed 3, and gave specific stories for 3 of them. But here it makes it seem like he's never told anyone outside the book. He's thrown in the hole for a pencil. He was always disciplined. I don't know if it was for something like that. Lesser sends a typed manuscript to a publisher. He did try to get it published for 40 years, even before Pantram was hanged. Beats the one guard to death with an iron bar in the prison laundry. True. He killed Robert Warnke on June 20th, 1929, and then placed in the isolation ward. True. Pantram meets Dr. Carl Menninger, who was the doctor brought in to test his sanity. Now, yes, that was a real person. That is his real name, and Menninger was brought in to test his sanity or to profile him. Now, I don't know if Carl freaked out and threatened him over the notion of his sanity being tested. Because basically, by this point, he wants to be sentenced to hang. And if his sanity comes into question, he could be spared the death penalty, and he doesn't want that. He refuses to be tested or defended in court as he wants to be sentenced to hang. True, by the end of his life, he regularly stated and wrote that he was done with life and ready to die. Goes on trial for the murder of the guard. He refuses counsel and represents himself. True, but I believe the trial was actually for the initial house burglary that he was arrested for in 1928. And, this sentenced to 25 years, though they had his confessions and witnesses to murders. He was found guilty and sentenced to death in the film. Real life, it was 25 years to life. Sentenced to Leavenworth. And then while he was serving, there was this big thing about bringing the death penalty back, and and then he was the first one to be executed. So 1929 is when he was sentenced to Leavenworth. Shows the gallows being built just outside the prison. True. Lesser tells his wife he gave his notice and is going to quit being a guard. He became a parole officer and then became a junior warden's assistant even after Pantram was hanged. But he did resign from all prison reform in 1935. He saw there was just a lack of improvement. So he did resign in 1935. He was unemployed for a bit, and then he worked in men's clothing and a department store. A reverend and an assistant meets Carl to try to get him to sign a petition against capital punishment, and he just insults them and threatens them. I know at least 2 priests showed up and with similar results. But I don't know if they were for the death penalty or if it was like a last rites type of situation, because he didn't want that either. Shows Carl and Lester corresponding, because at this time Lester has left the prison. True, they corresponded up until his death. Lester meets with Carl before his execution and hugs him. I don't know if that happened. Lester it's kind of hard to find stuff on him. Now, it does show him as gleefully running up the stairs to the gallows, like not even being guided by guards, like literally running on his own, which is true. He says, "Come on, I could hang 10 men and the time is taking you to hang one," which is similar to, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you're fooling around." So similar line. And it shows his hanging, like it shows him drop, and you see the neck, like, so, it shows it. And then it ends with Lester going to a bar and buying everyone drinks with these 2 coins that this one prisoner gave him after being paroled. But it ends, we go back to that interview with the older Lester, which is not really him. He died in 1983. But it says Carl was buried in an unmarked grave, which is true. The graves over at Fort Leavenworth are little squares, maybe about this big by like that tall. They'll have the names stamped or carved on them. Panzram's is just blank. How we spent 40 years trying to publish the book and then finally succeeded, 1970. True. Which... it has co-author credit, so I think they put a lot of context into the biography part. And I don't think it's everything Panzram wrote. But, and then it says that after, it shows him holding a copy of it. And then after it was published, he got all these calls wanting him to come lecture at places about prison reform, which he did with pleasure. And then he gives a quote from, is it called the Talmud or something like that? And that's the end of the movie. And then it says, dedicated to Sam Peckinpah. So a good movie. Again, it's not really based on the life of Carl Panzram. Not really based on the life and crimes of Panzram. Again, it kind of not really glosses over, but it sort of breezes through a lot of it. Really putting more emphasis on like the burglary and stuff like that. Not really the serial killer side of him. But it is more so about the friendship between this guy that hates the world, who's been brutalized his whole life, who is a serial killer, and a guard. In a world where, or in an environment where brutality is the way of life. So it's a really good story. I think they captured it well. Even if it's not the serial killer biopic that I think a lot of people might think it is, or would think it would be, it's still pretty good. I love true crime. I love the stories of all these people. So even a movie that just takes place during a certain window or a certain time or event, as long as it's done well, I think it's worth it. It's fairly accurate. They kind of consolidate a lot of events or things. It does, really shorten his life story, the flashback segment. But it's well made, very well acted. I really like Woods as Panzram. He actually did better than I expected. So pretty solid film. I do have a handful of other serial killer films and documentaries to get to. I'm not sure what order I'll be doing them in. I got a ton of stuff coming in the mail soon. Mostly books. So going into like the second week of January is when I'm expected to have stuff in. So maybe then I'll do like a full collection video. But definitely have more videos coming, so stay tuned for those. And thank you for watching.